Logan stood in the central hallway of Nexera Systems, a dense cardboard box held tightly in his hands, watching the glass doors reflect the cold morning light of the financial district. Three men in tailored dark suits walked through the glass entrance of the main conference room, carrying slim high-end laptops and leather portfolios with absolute clinical precision. Logan recognized every face among them, not because they were corporate rivals, but because he had spent months teaching them every first command and infrastructure blueprint they now carried. Chief Executive Officer Evelyn had just authorized $200,000 a year for each expert, completely unaware of the technical architecture beneath her newly acquired corporate structure. She possessed no knowledge that the maintenance technician she had structurally adjusted 9 days ago at $80,000 a year was the architect who authored the entire digital framework. The corporate mechanism had systematically replaced the creator with the very products of his own instruction, initiating a structural transition that the current leadership deemed an operational optimization. Logan's gray technical jacket showed faint signs of wear at the right cuff, a mechanical marking from 3 consecutive years of resting against the sharp edges of the primary server desks. Inside the main conference room, Dominic adjusted his luxury watch, guiding Evelyn's attention toward the data models displayed on the glass screens, ensuring the displacement remained completely unmentioned. Carter turned his head slightly, his eyes cutting through the transparent partition to land on the solitary man holding the box, a complex wave of recognition flickering across his face. Logan did not alter his pace, moving toward the primary exit elevators as the heavy glass doors of Nexera Systems closed behind him, sealing the structural shift in absolute silence. Long before the structural adjustments were finalized, Logan spent his quiet hours navigating the deepest layers of Nexera's data infrastructure. During a routine storage audit on a Tuesday midnight, his terminal interface populated a directory path that was never registered in any operational manual. Nested 4 levels beneath the standard network routing protocols lay a heavily encrypted communication vault, completely isolated from public access lines. Logan did not attempt to force open the files, he simply observed the metadata tags linking Dominic's authorization key to an outside firm. He noted the exact coordinate path into his long-term memory with the absolute stillness of a machine cataloging a minor anomaly. Meanwhile, on the executive floor, Dominic stood beside a digital whiteboard, pointing to a slide deck titled Workforce Optimization and Capability Expansion. He spoke to Evelyn with a fluent, highly rehearsed cadence, presenting his calculated arguments for replacing the current internal maintenance tier. Dominic skillfully framed the immense annual cost of the 3 incoming elite consultants as an essential asset investment for future enterprise growth. Evelyn sat across the long dark teak desk, her chin resting on her hand, her sharp analytical mind tracking the financial columns with intense scrutiny. She accepted the data models presented by her chief operating officer, totally unaware that the core system was being detached from its developer. It was precisely noon on a Wednesday when the human resources representative located Logan inside the primary server cooling chamber. Because of a half-day schedule at school, Grace was sitting on his spare jacket near the floor vents, quietly sketching inside a small notebook. The representative, a young woman named Sandra, handed him a crisp white envelope with the stiff posture of someone executing an uncomfortable structural mandate. She recited the mechanical phrases of structural adjustment, position eliminated, access credentials revoked, as if reading from a strictly coded operational script. Logan placed his sandwich on the metal casing of the terminal, took the envelope, and slowly turned it over in his hands without showing any visible disruption. He asked a single operational question: who was going to handle the phase drift condition on Node 7 once his profile was detached? Sandra looked at him with absolute incomprehension, her expression indicating she possessed no mental map for terms like thermal behavior or cascade sequencing. She simply stated that the incoming elite team had been granted complete access to the comprehensive system documentation. Logan nodded once, an efficient micro-movement of acknowledgement, sliding the termination envelope directly into the pocket of his gray jacket. He turned back to his terminal, completed the final routing correction he had been running, and executed a clean log save before completely shutting down his workstation. Logan stood up from the console, smoothly picking up Grace's small drawing notebook and her metal crayon tin from the floor grating. Grace gathered her worn stuffed rabbit, Biscuit, tucking it securely under her left arm as she stood up beside the towering black servers. They walked together across the main technical floor, a small child holding the hand of the man who had architected the entire structural framework. As they approached the lobby elevators, their path intersected with the glass walls of the executive conference room, mirroring their earlier arrival. A small gathering of corporate employees stood near the perimeter, watching the introduction of the new elite team with mechanical corporate applause. Down in the main lobby, Marcus, the veteran security guard who knew every regular employee by name, stepped out from behind his polished desk. Marcus held the heavy architectural glass door open, offering a quiet, respectful nod to the departing technician without asking a single operational question. Stepping out into the warm afternoon, Grace tugged at Logan's hand, looking up to ask about the men in the tailored corporate jackets. Logan looked down the financial block, stating simply that he had taught them, evaluating their current capability without any trace of structural bitterness. Grace accepted the objective fact and requested ice cream, prompting Logan to guide her down the pavement without a single backward glance at the tower. That evening, the structural contrast shifted to a modest brick apartment, insulated from the towering glass architecture of the financial district. Grace slept soundly in the adjacent room, her breathing steady, the worn stuffed rabbit tucked securely beneath her chin. Logan sat in isolation at the wooden kitchen table, his personal laptop open, the screen casting a pale light across the dark room. He possessed no intention of browsing the digital employment networks, despite the rapid circulation of his sudden operational availability among industry peers. Instead, he was constructing a comprehensive operational index for the core grid, writing with the absolute precision of a solitary architect. This was not a polished corporate presentation, but a raw, structural survival manual designed for catastrophic system failures at 3 a.m. His fingers moved across the keyboard in a calculated rhythm, documenting the undocumented edge case behaviors and manual override sequences. At the center of the architecture file, he isolated the thermal management module, the specific subsystem he had built to regulate ambient heat anomalies. He typed the exact activation conditions for the phase drift on node 7, logging the precise temperature and load thresholds required for stability. Completing the reinitialization sequence, he saved the file strictly to his local hardware, leaving the external corporate servers completely disconnected from his knowledge. On the following Monday, the newly installed elite trio held their official initiation meeting with the chief executive and the chief operating officer inside the main boardroom. Carter projected a visually impressive 18-month roadmap designed to systematically modernize the underlying infrastructure layer and expand overall system capacity for new enterprise acquisitions. Evelyn observed the presentation with her arms folded, her sharp analytical focus locking onto the projected 17% reduction in cloud operational expenditures. Dominic reviewed the seamless delivery with visible satisfaction, fully convinced that his structural transition had successfully eliminated the prior architectural dependency without consequence. Returning to the technical operations floor, Carter initiated access to the original grid architecture files, intending to comprehend the foundational logic before commencing modifications. He encountered dense, uniquely structured logic files and hand-annotated architectural diagrams that refused to conform to standard institutional coding conventions he was accustomed to. Perceiving the framework as mechanically archaic, Carter determined that the foundational documentation required complete refactoring before the new optimization protocols could be safely implemented. During the initial 14-day operational window, the team systematically identified and eliminated multiple secondary background processes they classified as strictly redundant logging functions. From an external analytical perspective, the specific monitoring loop attached to Node 7 appeared entirely duplicative, presenting an obvious target for structural efficiency. Executing the deletion command, Carter permanently removed the secondary validation check, completely unaware that he had just dismantled the critical state memory anchor for the thermal management module. Exactly 3 weeks after the structural transition, a historic atmospheric heat event descended upon the financial district. For 4 consecutive days, exterior temperatures remained locked at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing corporate infrastructure to operate at absolute maximum capacity. Inside the Nexera server facility, the primary climate control units pushed cold air violently through the floor vents, struggling against the ambient thermal load. Deep within the server architecture, the quadrant housing Node 7 began to register internal environment temperatures crossing 93.2 degrees. The mechanical stress on the hardware increased exponentially as the enterprise routing demands pushed the processing load past 94% of peak capacity. Under normal operational protocols, the thermal management module would activate its state memory to stabilize the drift. However, the critical validation check had been permanently erased during the recent optimization sweep, leaving the logic sequence unanchored. At exactly 11:47 in the evening, the system interface displayed the first irregular latency spikes across the Node 7 routing tables. The automated monitoring algorithms flagged the anomalies merely as moderate priority alerts, completely misinterpreting the severity of the structural deviation. Blind to the impending mechanical cascade, the server racks continued to process data as the thermal sync module silently spiraled into a fatal error loop. The moderate alerts rapidly multiplied across the terminal screens, and at exactly 11:52, the latency spikes evolved into cascading errors across the internal network. The thermal sync module, unable to locate its state memory, spiraled into a continuous error loop, causing massive hardware desynchronization. At 3 minutes past midnight, the primary routing layer of Nexera grid completely collapsed under the unmanaged thermal load. 47 global enterprise clients lost their connectivity simultaneously, their digital infrastructure plunging into sudden, unexplained isolation. At 5 minutes past midnight, Evelyn's personal phone illuminated on her dark teak desk with an incoming emergency call from Dominic. She answered immediately, recognizing the specific controlled cadence in his voice that indicated a catastrophic systemic failure had occurred. Dominic stood in his own dark apartment, delivering the operational collapse metrics while maintaining a carefully constructed tone of professional detachment. Evelyn demanded an immediate timeline for recovery, ordering the newly acquired technical team to the facility without a second of delay. By 12:15, Carter, Adrian, and Isaac rushed into the Nexera server chamber, their earlier corporate confidence entirely absent. The atmosphere within the room had fundamentally altered, radiating heavy heat as monolithic black screens displayed cascading sequences of red error states. Carter executed his first diagnostic sequence at 12:22, incorrectly identifying the cascade as a standard load balancer failure on Node 7. He commanded an immediate hardware restart, but the massive server racks remained unresponsive, refusing to synchronize under the extreme thermal pressure. Adrian immediately took the secondary terminal, identifying a database replication error induced by the mismatched states of the restarted nodes. He recommended a structural rollback to a backup snapshot captured 6 hours prior, attempting to overwrite the corrupted system memory. The rollback process consumed 22 agonizing minutes, momentarily bringing the primary network back online at 12:57. However, the temporary stability lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds before collapsing completely, spreading the cascade across 3 additional quadrants. Isaac took the third rotational attempt, determining that the routing tables had been heavily corrupted by the partial data states of the botched rollback. He initiated a frantic manual rebuild of the routing architecture, a desperate mechanical effort that stretched out for 47 minutes. The system revived briefly at 2:13 in the morning, held for 9 minutes, and then experienced a total structural death, obliterating the backup failovers. Evelyn stood silently in the corner of the sweltering chamber, her untouched coffee grown completely cold, watching the 3 expensive experts reach the absolute limits of their understanding. Breaking the heavy silence, Evelyn turned toward the 3 experts, demanding an immediate and viable solution to the structural collapse. Dominic remained near the primary exit, his previously constructed corporate confidence dissolving into a pale, unreadable expression of total systemic defeat. Carter sat completely isolated in front of his lifeless terminal, his hands hovering over the mechanical keyboard without executing a single command. Staring into the dark monitor, his analytical mind traced back to the non-standard architectural diagrams he had dismissed weeks earlier. He recalled a specific structural training session from 4 years ago, led by the exact maintenance technician they had recently replaced. The realization crystallized in his mind: the background process he had permanently deleted was the vital anchor for the thermal management module. Acknowledging the absolute limit of his technical capacity, Carter reached into his dark suit pocket and slowly withdrew his smartphone. He navigated through his digital contact archive, his thumb pausing over a specific number he had not accessed in over 2 years. Bypassing the established corporate hierarchy, Carter initiated the external connection, pressing the cold glass device against his ear. A singular digital dialing tone echoed faintly within the sweltering server chamber, bridging the gap between the failed architecture and its original creator. The signal bridged the distance instantly, illuminating Logan's personal device on the simple wooden kitchen table where the baseline manual lay complete. Logan answered the line without a fraction of hesitation, his voice cutting through the speaker with absolute, unhurried operational stability. Carter spoke into the cold glass, his cadence fracturing as he delivered a direct validation of the failure expanding across the Node 7 framework. There was no trace of structural resentment in Logan's position. He merely monitored the verbal data layout before requesting direct executive contact. Carter stepped away from the dark terminal bank, extending the illuminated mobile device toward Evelyn, who stood motionless in the sterile corridor. Evelyn took the phone with a calculating sweep of her hand, her mind instantly adjusting to evaluate this unexpected human variable. Logan stated the structural parameters of the thermal sink module smoothly, bypassing any personal history regarding his technical displacement 9 days prior. He demanded an unhindered workstation environment and 4 hours of absolute authority to circumvent the impending contractual penalty thresholds. Evelyn blinked once, confirming the severe 5.5-hour deadline before executing an immediate verbal authorization of his return terms. The connection terminated in absolute silence as Logan reached for his gray technical jacket, initiating his return to the corporate center. The yellow taxi navigated the sparse early morning traffic, its tires tracking smoothly over the warm pavement of the financial district. Inside the vehicle, Logan stared out the side window, his face reflecting the deep blue transitions of the pre-dawn skyline. At exactly 2:38 in the morning, Logan stepped through the massive structural glass entrance of the Nexera Systems tower. Marcus held the heavy architectural glass door open, offering a quiet, respectful nod to the departing technician without asking a single operational question. The elevator doors parted on the technical operations floor, revealing the high-contrast dimness of a corporate network in state failure. Evelyn stood positioned directly outside the server room door, her sharp analytical gaze locked onto the projected 17% reduction in cloud operational expenditures. Dominic remained separated near the corridor corner, his posture defensive as he observed the return of the displaced system architect. Bypassing the corporate leadership without an introductory gesture, Logan pushed open the heavy mechanical double doors of the server chamber. Inside, the clinical air was thick with thermal buildup, and the red light emitted from the terminal mainframe saturated the space. Carter turned his head slightly, his eyes cutting through the transparent partition to land on the solitary man holding the box, a complex wave of recognition flickering across his face. Logan advanced to the central command console, his measured steps cutting through the dense, overheating atmosphere of the primary storage vault. He placed his fingers onto the mechanical input deck, instantly clearing the cluttered error logs that the previous team had generated. Bypassing Carter's verbal explanations without an organic response, Logan initiated a customized sub-level command line sequence into the core matrix. The terminal interface populated thousands of raw alphanumeric strings, illuminating his weathered Caucasian facial lines in sharp monochrome blue. He systematically isolated the secondary background data noise, narrowing the systemic focus entirely onto the expanding thermal drift at Node 7. Evelyn maintained her position 2 feet behind the operator station, her intense blue eyes monitoring his precise physical execution. Out in the sterile corridor, Dominic gripped his corporate tablet interface, attempting to establish a remote bridge into the Active Directory. The digital screen rejected his credential tokens repeatedly, flashing a cold restriction prompt across his expensive gold-rimmed glasses. Evelyn had silently executed an administrative freeze on his high-level credentials, stripping away his visibility from the baseline platform. Back inside the chamber, Logan locked the diagnostic sequence onto the unanchored memory blocks, uncovering the exact source of structural death. Logan initiated the manual reinitialization sequence, inputting structural string operations to bind the unanchored thermal memory allocations back to Node 7. The central processing units resisted the early sequence, pushing back with localized resistance until the core architectural values forced compliance. He established a rigid 6-minute cooling interval baseline, withholding further input execution to allow the operational hardware parameters to stabilize. Carter moved 2 inches closer to the desk perimeter, his analytical gaze deconstructing the non-standard synchronization loops shifting across the terminal screen. The elite technicians recognized that their prior optimization attempt had actively dismantled the only structural defense mechanism against high-load thermal drift. Evelyn watched the data visualization modules closely, tracking a microstabilization sequence as the vertical temperature lines ceased their upward movement. Out in the dim operations hallway, Dominic lowered his inactive hardware tablet, his posture hardening into an expression of isolated exposure. Logan executed the tertiary algorithmic phase script, matching the data execution timing precisely with the hardware's internal physical heat variance. The clinical chamber air handlers adjusted their mechanical pitch, responding to the subtle systemic alignment expanding throughout the primary storage core. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, the interface terminal populated a solid amber prompt indicating the baseline synchronization was complete. With phase sync established, Logan initiated the staged node restart sequence, matching the specific hardware thermal timing to prevent another thermal cascade. He monitored the cooling telemetry as Node 7 reasserted its state memory, holding the operational parameters stable under 90-degree ambient heat. At exactly 3:29 in the morning, the primary routing layer of NextCore Grid successfully established an uninterrupted connection pathway. The green indicators cascaded across the secondary hardware racks, signaling the progressive recovery of the distributed database arrays. By 3:44, the automated dashboard confirmed that all 47 global enterprise clients had successfully re-established their active secure channels. The sweltering atmosphere of the chamber slowly dissipated as the climate control system synchronized with the stabilized hardware performance metrics. Carter let out a slow, controlled breath, his shoulders dropping from their previously rigid posture of absolute, high-stakes technical panic. Isaac sat heavily in a peripheral mesh chair, his head resting back against the cold partition wall, processing the massive near-miss. Logan did not halt his operations, he executed a final, comprehensive system validation sequence to verify the absolute integrity of the grid. The verification sequence compiled flawlessly, populating a clean, green system status prompt as Logan calmly pushed the mechanical keyboard away. The primary server chamber doors clicked shut as the 3 technical specialists vacated the core perimeter, leaving Logan and Evelyn within the silent workspace. The mechanical roar decreased to a predictable baseline frequency loop, leaving only the steady hum of validated network architecture processing enterprise telemetry. Evelyn moved forward, executing a calculated lateral shift to sit in the secondary mesh chair that Adrian had recently abandoned. She looked directly across the console panel at Logan, her sharp blue eyes adopting an analytical focus completely devoid of artificial corporate preamble. She demanded to comprehend the underlying rationale for his silence when the Human Resources Department delivered the structural separation notice 9 days prior. Logan maintained his level gaze, his physical framework completely motionless against the dim backdrop of the functional computing array infrastructure. He stated that the executive authorization had already been finalized based on a document that structurally defined his profile as a maintenance technician. He evaluated the past interaction as a baseline structural reality, noting that verbal data carries no systemic weight without the required operational context. Evelyn absorbed the factual accounting without a visible micro-expression of denial, her mind processing the severe limitations of her original organizational map. The terminal monitor continued to display the static green validation parameters, casting a balanced illumination over the two figures locked in silent evaluation. Evelyn maintained her calculating composure, evaluating the sheer weight of Logan's factual declaration as the system continued to run clean. Logan reached smoothly into his gray jacket pocket, withdrawing a small piece of rough paper containing a sequence of handwritten data paths. He stated that his mechanical displacement was not merely an operational efficiency strategy implemented by the internal leadership tier. He delivered a cold narrative regarding an unindexed structural branch within the core file repository, completely unmentioned in corporate briefs. During a standard capacity analysis months back, his technician credentials had accidentally mapped an isolated directory containing encrypted executive activities. Logan placed the written path coordinates flatly onto the console desk surface, pushing the document directly toward the chief executive officer. He provided no personal moral judgment on the discovery, characterizing the encrypted folder simply as an unaligned system variance. Evelyn locked her visual focus onto the paper, her piercing blue eyes calculating the immense structural hazard hidden inside the corporate chart. Out in the adjacent operations zone, Dominic paced with rigid strides, totally unaware that his electronic footprint was being mapped. Logan leaned back into his workstation seat, leaving the newly discovered architectural data layer entirely under her executive command. Evelyn slowly extended her hand, her manicured fingers closing over the rough paper strip containing the unindexed coordinate paths. She navigated the terminal console, inputting the exact hexadecimal string directory with calculated, precise finger movements. The secure interface populated a dense network of encrypted messages, detailing private communications between Dominic and an outside competitor. Evelyn read the files for several agonizing minutes in absolute silence, her cold facial features reflecting the blue terminal glow. The raw logs revealed a coordinated strategy to extract the core infrastructure blueprints while systematically isolating its original designer. The structural alignment of her corporate map fractured, exposing the profound discrepancy between Dominic's briefings and the baseline data. She raised her head slowly, her intense blue eyes observing the unhurried maintenance technician who held the key to the entire system. Logan remained completely still, his composure unbreached by the political revelation, focusing strictly on the stabilized cooling loops of Node 7. Outside the clear glass partition, Dominic noticed her sudden, rigid stillness, his physical frame freezing as he sensed his administrative exposure. Evelyn logged out of the secure directory, placing her device face down on the dark desk as she prepared to recalculate her next executive move. Evelyn adjusted her posture, turning fully toward Logan with a serious expression that signaled a fundamental reallocation of corporate authority. She openly acknowledged the systemic operational failure caused by her previous optimization choices, which had been based on heavily manipulated data pools. The Chief Executive Officer offered Logan the permanent position of Chief Infrastructure Officer, granting him absolute structural sovereignty over the digital network. Under this proposed administrative layer, he would report directly to her, managing all architectural evaluations, engineering headcounts, and resource pipelines. He would possess the immediate authority to reconstruct the comprehensive system documentation that should have been officially preserved 3 years ago. Logan monitored the verbal proposal without a single physical micro-movement, his calm face remaining neutral under the steady console light. The distributed routing network continued to process the immense enterprise traffic flows without a fraction of mechanical resistance or drift. Evelyn waited for his response vector in complete stillness, her piercing blue eyes searching his weathered profile for a sign of compliance. The room maintained its quiet baseline hum, sealing the two individuals inside an objective atmosphere of calculated administrative negotiation. Logan did not answer the executive proposal immediately, his gaze dropping to the handwritten coordinate path paper resting on the dark console. He processed the massive structural elevation being offered, juxtaposing the corporate authority against the quiet domestic reality of his sleeping child. Breaking the silence, Logan stated mechanically that he needed to transport Grace to her educational facility in the morning. Evelyn blinked, the sudden introduction of a parental baseline priority momentarily disrupting her calculated administrative frameworks. Logan requested a single operational day to evaluate the structural transition, promising a definitive response by the next business cycle. Without waiting for executive validation, he stood up from the console chair, breaking the physical stasis of the negotiation. He lifted his worn gray technical jacket from the back of the mesh chair, preparing to extract himself from the corporate center. The heavy metal server doors opened, and Carter stepped back into the chamber carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. Seeing Logan departing, Carter froze, extending one of the paper cups forward in a silent gesture of structural respect. Logan accepted the coffee smoothly, holding the warm cup as he delivered one final piece of architectural advice to his replacement. Logan stepped past the heavy metal threshold, carrying the paper coffee cup as he left the stabilized cooling chamber behind. Evelyn remained near the primary console, tracking his departure with absolute clarity regarding the structural shift in corporate power. Dominic watched from the peripheral corridor, completely isolated from the operational core and facing inevitable administrative termination. The brushed steel elevator doors closed, descending through the towering corporate architecture, carrying the system's architect back to the ground level. Down in the expansive main lobby, Marcus stood behind the polished stone desk, observing the technician's early morning exit. They exchanged a single, silent nod of mutual recognition, bypassing any requirement for verbal operational debriefing. Logan pushed through the massive glass exit doors, stepping out into the cool, sharp air of the financial district dawn. The sky above the towering structures transitioned into a pale morning gray, reflecting off the monolithic glass surfaces of the city. He raised his hand smoothly to signal a passing yellow taxi, initiating his transit back to his residential perimeter. Sitting in the back seat, his analytical mind shifted completely from infrastructure algorithms to the preparation of his daughter's morning routine. The yellow taxi pulled to a smooth halt in front of a modest brick apartment building, far removed from the towering corporate infrastructure. Logan completed the transactional exchange with the driver, stepping out onto the quiet residential pavement as the morning sun continued to rise. He navigated the narrow staircase of the building, his physical movement remaining measured and deliberate despite the extreme operational fatigue. Reaching his designated unit, he inserted the brass key into the lock, turning the mechanism with absolute precision to avoid unnecessary noise. The interior of the apartment was calm, illuminated only by the faint morning light filtering through the standard glass windows. Dorothy, the elderly neighbor who had maintained the domestic watch, sat quietly at the wooden kitchen table reading a hardbound book. Logan offered a brief, respectful nod of gratitude, acknowledging her critical support during his sudden extraction to the server facility. Dorothy closed her book and gathered her belongings, exiting the residential unit with a soft smile that required no extensive dialogue. Removing his worn gray technical jacket, Logan walked silently down the short hallway toward the secondary bedroom. He observed Grace resting exactly as he had left her, her breathing steady, entirely isolated from the technological crisis he had just dismantled. 40 minutes later, the blue dawn fully transitioned into a vibrant morning, casting warm golden rays across the apartment's exposed brick walls. Grace emerged from the hallway corridor, her light brown hair thoroughly tangled, dragging Biscuit the stuffed rabbit by one worn ear. She climbed onto the tall kitchen bar stool with absolute mechanical inefficiency, throwing her entire small body weight into the maneuver. Looking directly at Logan, she executed her standard morning query, asking if he was scheduled to receive any loud vocal corrections at his workplace today. Logan, standing near the standard residential stove unit, replied with absolute factual accuracy that no one was yelling, and that the system was running perfectly clean. He retrieved a mixing bowl and a wooden spoon, transitioning seamlessly from stabilizing enterprise network structures to the precise formulation of breakfast batter. He confirmed the execution of the priority objective they had established the previous night, the production of the specifically categorized, good pancakes. Grace evaluated this data point with deep 6-year-old seriousness, her facial features relaxing into an expression of complete domestic satisfaction. Logan flipped the golden batter in the hot iron pan, the mechanical precision of the chief architect now focused entirely on achieving the perfect thermal sear.